One day in April, 1942, Hucknall Aerodrome, 7 miles north of Nottingham, England. A man named Ronald Harker climbs into the cockpit of a fighter he has never flown before. He is not at war. He is a test pilot for Rolls-Royce. His job today is a routine evaluation. He will be in the air for 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The length of a lunch break. The time it takes to drive across a small town. And yet, what Ronald Harker wrote down after he landed that morning would change the outcome of the Second World War. Not a general, not a president, not a weapons designer with 100 engineers under him. A test pilot. 1 flight. 30 minutes. And a single sheet of paper. I've spent years reading about this war, and I keep finding the same pattern. The moments that changed everything weren't in the command rooms. They happened quietly, in places no one was watching, by people who weren't trying to be remembered. In this video, we're going to follow that flight, step by step, name by name, all the way to the skies over Berlin in 1944. We're going to meet the man who designed the most important American fighter of the war, a man born in Germany, the Polish refugee who confirmed the math that made it possible, and the Reichsmarshal who sat across a wooden table in a ruined city and told an American general, out loud, exactly why he had lost. This story has been sitting in archive boxes for 60 years. Most people have never heard it told in full. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the version with names and dates and the details that didn't make it into the textbooks, hit that like button before we go any further. It costs you nothing. And it tells me to keep making these. Let's start where this story actually begins. Not in Washington. Not in London. In a small German town in the Rhineland. 1899. Edgar Schmood was born in Hornbach, in the Rhineland-Palatinate, on December 30th, 1899. His father Heinrich was an Austrian, which meant Edgar carried Austrian papers through his father's side, even though the town he grew up in, the language he thought in, the countryside he walked through as a boy, was German in every way that matters to a child. His mother was from Stuttgart. The family was not wealthy. There were no engineers in the bloodline, no aeronautical tradition, no reason on paper, no reason at all, really, to expect that this boy, surrounded by vineyards and church spires, would one day design the airplane that saved the Allied air campaign. He decided at 8 years old, the first time he saw an airplane pass overhead, one of the fragile, rattling machines of the pre-war years. He made up his mind. He was going to spend his life building them. Germany in those years didn't require a university degree for engineers. What it required was patience and a willingness to teach yourself. Schmood apprenticed at a small engine factory. He read technical manuals at night, by whatever light he had. He designed several engine components and received patents for them before he was 30. Then the Weimar Republic collapsed around him. The hyperinflation, the unemployment, a country eating itself from the inside. In 1925, Edgar Schmood packed what he owned and emigrated to Brazil. He took a job with General Aviation, the air branch of General Motors, in São Paulo. 6 years later, General Motors sponsored him for a visa to the United States. He arrived in 1931. The Great Depression had effectively closed the American border. He was, according to immigration records, one of 794 people admitted under the quota that year. He had a job offer from a General Motors aviation subsidiary in New Jersey. He stepped off the boat with that offer in hand, and nothing else he could count on. By 1936, after his employer's aviation division was reorganized into what became North American Aviation, after a personal tragedy on a California highway that cost him his wife and nearly his own life, he was at North American's facility in Los Angeles, working as a preliminary design engineer. He was quiet. He wore the same kind of plain gray suit every day. He worked late every night of the week. He had a card taped to his drafting table. His colleagues, who eventually numbered in the thousands, used to joke that the only reliable way to know when Ed Schmood had gone home for the night was when his drafting lamp finally went dark. History remembers the generals. The drafting room remembers the men like Schmood, the ones who came in before everyone else and stayed after everyone left, and never once mentioned it. In the spring of 1940, the British Purchasing Commission came to North American aviation with a proposition. Britain was desperate for fighters. Any fighters. Would North American build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license? North American's president, James Howard Kindleberger, Dutch, to everyone who knew him, walked across the floor to Schmood's drafting table and asked him the question. Schmood had been waiting for exactly this question. He told Kindleberger, "Don't build an obsolete airplane. I can design a better one from scratch, and I can do it fast." Kindleberger went back to the British. The British gave North American a formal contract on May 29, 1940. 320 aircraft, 120 days to produce a working prototype. 117 days later, on September 9, 1940, the prototype rolled out of the Inglewood hangar. The Allison engine hadn't arrived yet. They photographed the airplane with dummy exhaust stacks. What Schmood and his team had drawn was already extraordinary. A laminar flow wing profile, derived from the newest NACA aerodynamic research. A belly radiator scoop that used what engineers called the Meredith effect, recovering some of its own cooling drag, cutting the aerodynamic penalty that crippled other fighters at high speed. The airplane was clean in a way that very few single-engine fighters had ever been. The Allison V1710 engine was what the American government had required North American to install. Below 15,000 feet, it was competitive. Above 20,000 feet, it gasped. And the air war of 1942 was being fought above 20,000 feet. The Royal Air Force received its first production Mustangs in the autumn of 1941. They flew them for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, because that was all the Allison engine allowed. One of the finest fighter airframes ever designed spent almost 2 years in the wrong role, doing the wrong job because it could not breathe at altitude. While this was happening, the American daylight bombing campaign over Germany was beginning to come apart. The doctrine the Army Air Corps had spent the 1930s developing rested on a conviction: a bomber properly armed, flying in tight formation, could get through to any target without fighter escort. The B-17 Flying Fortress bristled with machine guns in every direction. Its overlapping fields of fire, calculated carefully at Maxwell Field in Alabama, were supposed to form an interlocking shield no fighter could survive. The men who wrote this doctrine were not fools. They had reasons to believe what they believed. They spent the first 2 years of the bombing campaign discovering they had been wrong. American P-47 Thunderbolts could escort the bombers to the German border, and no further. The Germans had learned to wait. Their fighter controllers watched on radar as the escorts turned for home. Then the interceptors fell on the unprotected bombers and stayed with them all the way across Germany and all the way back. For the men flying those bombers, what this meant in practice was something they rarely talked about when they came home. Every morning at an English airfield, before first light, a crew of 10 would sit down to breakfast together. Real eggs, if they were lucky. The cooks always tried to give them real eggs on mission days. Then they would walk out to their airplane in the dark, check their equipment, and wait. They knew the math. A tour of duty was 25 missions. The statistical probability that any individual crew would complete all 25 through the worst months of 1943 was somewhere around 1 in 3. They knew this. They ate the eggs anyway. They walked out to the airplane anyway, because the alternative, not going, letting someone else go in their place, was the one thing none of them could bring themselves to do. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched 376 B-17 toward the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The escorts turned back at the German border. 60 fortresses did not come home. 2 months later, October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, 291 B-17 flew to Schweinfurt again. No long-range escort, because there was no long-range escort to send. 60 more bombers shot down. 17 more scrapped after landing. More than 600 American airmen killed, captured, or wounded in a single afternoon. The commanding general of the 8th Air Force wrote afterward that the daylight bombing campaign had, for the time being, simply collapsed. Deep penetration raids were suspended. In Berlin, Göring read the intelligence reports and convinced himself that the American experiment was finished. The self-defending bomber had failed. The Luftwaffe had won. He was wrong. But the airplane that would prove him wrong was already in development. And the man who had set that in motion had just landed at Hucknall, walked back to his desk, and picked up a pen. Ronald Ward Harker was born at Tynemouth, on the northeast coast of England, in 1909. By 1942, he was the senior service liaison test pilot for Rolls-Royce. His job was precise. When the Royal Air Force wanted an aircraft evaluated on behalf of its engine suppliers, Harker was the man who flew it. One day in April 1942, the commanding officer of the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord, invited Harker to take a Mustang Mark I up for an evaluation. Harker flew it for 30 minutes. The next morning, May 1, 1942, at Rolls-Royce's flight test establishment at Hucknall, he sat down and wrote a memorandum. It is one of the quietly decisive documents of the entire air war. He praised the Mustang's handling. He praised its speed at low altitude, exceptional, faster than anything comparable. He praised its range. Then he identified the problem. The Allison engine was holding the airframe back. But Harker had been flying Rolls-Royce's new Merlin 61, the two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine being fitted at that moment to the new Spitfire Mark IX. And 30 minutes over the English Midlands had been enough. He wrote that the Mustang, fitted with a Merlin, would become the most formidable fighter in the world. The conversions that followed would use the Merlin 65, a close variant, better suited for direct comparison. But Harker's arithmetic was the same either way. The two-stage supercharger would give this airframe what the Allison had denied it, performance above 20,000 feet. He had no wind tunnel data, no formal research team. He had a pilot's feel for an airplane, 20 years of experience, and the ability to do the math in his head. That was all. And he was exactly right. Rolls-Royce's chief aerodynamic engineer at Hucknall, Witold Challier, a man who had escaped Poland in 1939 and brought his calculations with him, confirmed Harker's numbers on paper. A Merlin Mustang, Challier's figures predicted, would reach 441 miles per hour in level flight at 25,600 feet. The British Air Ministry was not enthusiastic. Every Merlin being produced was already allocated to Spitfires, to Lancasters, to Mosquitoes. There was no appetite for an experiment with an American airframe. Harker and his colleagues went around them. They reached Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, a man with a long record of backing unconventional projects that turned out to be right. Freeman authorized the trial. 4 Mustang airframes were set aside for conversion at Hucknall. The first to fly, serial number AL975, fitted with a Merlin 65 and a 4-bladed Rotoll propeller, took off on October 13, 1942, with Rolls-Royce's chief test pilot, Captain Ronald Shepard, at the controls. A second conversion reached 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. AL-975 itself was tested to an absolute ceiling of 40,600 feet. At almost the same moment, North Americans' engineers in California had arrived at the same conclusion by the same arithmetic, working entirely independently. They fitted Merlin engines shipped from England into American airframes. The Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit, which had signed a licensing agreement to produce the Merlin in the United States at a scale no British factory could match, would become the engine's American home. The first American Merlin Mustang, the XP-51B, flew in November 1942. By August of that year, before any Merlin Mustang had taken off, the Army Air Forces had placed an order for 400 production P-51Bs, staking everything on Challeur's arithmetic. By the middle of 1943, Merlin Mustangs were rolling off 2 production lines, one at Inglewood, California, one at a new plant in Dallas, Texas. By December of 1943, the first operational squadrons were arriving in England. All of it. Every airplane, every pilot, every mission that followed, traced back to one morning in April, one flight over the English Midlands, and one sheet of paper dated May 1st, 1942. On December 1st, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, a sweep over occupied France. 12 days later, on December 13th, they escorted a raid on Kiel, nearly 500 miles into Germany. For the first time in the war, an American single-engine fighter had gone that deep into the Reich and come back, inside the 8th Air Force. Those mission reports were read very carefully. One of the men reading them was a lieutenant colonel named Donald Blakesley from Fairport, Ohio, a pilot who had flown with the Royal Canadian Air Force and the RAF's Eagle squadrons before the United States entered the war. He had more hours in a Spitfire than almost any American pilot alive. He had been watching the Mustang for months. In February of 1944, he convinced the 8th Air Force Command to let his own unit, the 4th Fighter Group at Debden, transition to P-51Bs. The conversion training was minimal. Blakesley told his pilots they could learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. He was almost literally serious. On March 4, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group flew to Berlin. A full-scale raid had been recalled in bad weather on the 3rd. On the 4th, a reduced force reached the German capital for the first time in the war. 2 days later, March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched one of the largest single-day air battles in history. 730 heavy bombers, nearly 800 American fighters, including a full weight of Merlin Mustangs, flying in daylight. To Berlin, the Germans scrambled every interceptor they had. The bombers took heavy losses. 69 heavy bombers did not return, but the escort fighters fought all the way in and all the way out, and when the surviving Americans came home that evening, a fact of military geography had been permanently changed. The city of Berlin was no longer beyond the range of American escort fighters. It never would be again. 69 bombers lost is not a small number. Those are hundreds of men. And the men who planned that mission understood something cold and true. One day that changes the geometry of the entire air war is a price the campaign can absorb. Losing the campaign cannot be absorbed at all. In January of 1944, James Doolittle had taken command of the 8th Air Force. He looked at the loss reports. He looked at the Merlin Mustangs arriving in his fighter groups, and he made a decision his bomber crews hated. He ordered the fighters off the leash. No more close escort. The Mustangs were to sweep ahead and hunt, attack interceptors on the way in, roam freely on the way home. strafe Luftwaffe airfields wherever the opportunity arose. The bombers, Doolittle understood, were not really the weapon. The bombers were the bait, the only thing that would force the Luftwaffe up into the open. The Mustangs were the weapon. Inside the Luftwaffe, the man whose job it was to understand what had just happened was General Adolf Galland, 31 years old, commander of the German day fighter arm. He had been warning Göring for almost a year that if the Americans ever succeeded in putting a long-range escort fighter over the German heartland, Germany would become, in his own private phrase, a house without a roof. Göring had dismissed the warning. After March 6, 1944, dismissal was no longer possible. Between February 20th and 25th, 1944, 6 days the Americans called Big Week, the 8th Air Force and the 15th, operating from bases in Italy, launched 3,000 heavy bomber sorties against aircraft factories across southern and central Germany. The Americans lost 137 bombers and 28 fighters. The Luftwaffe lost close to 100 fighter pilots killed in that 1 week, roughly 17% of its available force. That last number is the one that mattered, not the airplanes, the pilots. Under Albert Speer's emergency production measures, the German aircraft industry actually reached its highest fighter output of the entire war in the autumn of 1944. Airplanes could be built. Experienced pilots, the men who had spent years learning to coordinate attacks against defended bomber formations, who knew how to fight outnumbered at altitude in weather, who had been doing this since Spain, since Poland, since the summer of 1940 over southern England, could not be manufactured. A Luftwaffe pilot facing American Mustangs in the spring of 1944 had received fewer training hours and less fuel than his adversary, who had often logged 300 to 500 hours before he ever saw combat. In March of 1944, the Luftwaffe wrote off close to 22% of its available day fighter pilots. In April, roughly another 20%. In May, attrition peaked near 25%. These were not percentages on a chart. They were names on a bulletin board every Monday morning, men who had been flying since Spain, since Poland, since the Battle of Britain. When they were gone, what replaced them was boys with 60 hours in a cockpit, facing pilots with 500. By the summer of 1944, the fighter arm Adolf Galland had spent his entire career building was no longer a strategic force. It was still there on paper. The factories were still producing. But the men who made it function, who knew how to think and coordinate and survive in the kind of fighting that decides air wars, were dying faster than any training system on Earth could replace them. D-Day, the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, took place under a sky that was effectively uncontested. A Luftwaffe that had terrorized Warsaw in 1939, Rotterdam in 1940, London in the autumn of that year, had, in less than 4 years, been pushed back to the ground. Galland had seen all of this coming. Through 1943 and into 1944, he had pleaded with Göring for mass deployment of the Me-262 jet fighter as an interceptor, not as a bomber, as Hitler had ordered, as an interceptor, the one role it had been designed for, the one role that might have changed something. He had warned, in writing, that the conventional fighter arm was being attrited to nothing. He had been ignored at every turn. In January of 1945, Göring relieved Galland of his command as general of the fighter arm. The official reason was vague. The real reason was the offense of having been persistently right, while his superiors had been persistently wrong. What happened next surprised everyone, including Göring. A group of Germany's highest-scoring fighter aces requested a formal meeting with the Reichsmarshal. These were men whose faces had been on propaganda posters, whose medals filled their chests, who had hundreds of aerial victories between them. Men Göring himself had promoted, decorated, paraded in front of cameras. They stood in front of him and said, collectively, that the air war was being lost because of decisions made at the top. They demanded changes. Göring's response was to place Galland under a form of informal house arrest. It was the closest the professional officers of the German military ever came to open mutiny. It achieved nothing. The war was already over in every way except the dying. May 10th, 1945. 3 days after Germany formally surrendered, officers of the United States Seventh Army had taken over a requisition school building in the ruined city of Augsburg. The building was called the Ritterschule. Someone had forgotten to wipe the previous week's arithmetic from one of the blackboards. A plain wooden table. 2 wooden chairs placed across from each other. The American general on one side of the table was Karl Spaatz, the officer most responsible over the previous 18 months for the destruction of the German Air Force. With him were 8 other men, generals, an aviation writer, an interpreter. And in the back of the room, taking notes by hand on a pad in his lap, a historian named Bruce Hopper. It is Hopper's notes that survive. He wrote down what the room looked like, the arithmetic on the blackboard, the plain wooden furniture, and he wrote down what the prisoner looked like. The prisoner arrived that afternoon, escorted by an American guard detail, walking in without handcuffs. He was heavy, a shade under 6 feet, something over 260 pounds. He wore a grayish wool uniform from which every badge of rank had been torn, except the field marshal's epaulets on his shoulders. On the 3rd finger of his right hand, a single silver ring. His eyes were blue. His face was ruddy. The face, Hopper wrote, of a man who had lived well in a country that had not. The prisoner was Hermann Göring. 2 days before the interrogation, he had still been, on paper, the second most powerful man in Germany. For 2 hours, Spaatz asked questions. They ranged across nearly every theater of the air war: the Eastern Front, radar, jet aircraft, oil, production. Göring answered at length. He blamed Hitler for diverting the Luftwaffe to Stalingrad. He regretted, in a phrase he repeated twice, his beautiful bomber fleet, wasted there. He credited American radar. He acknowledged the jet fighters had come too late. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, between questions about the Me-262 and questions about synthetic oil, Spaatz asked why the daylight bombing campaign had ultimately succeeded. Why, given everything the Luftwaffe had thrown at it, had the Americans been able to keep flying to German targets? There was a pause. Göring, the man who had commanded the largest air force in Europe at its peak, who had been a decorated fighter pilot himself in the previous war, who had stood in front of armaments workers in 1939 and promised them, with the certainty of a man who expected to win, that no enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, gave his answer. The reason for the failure of the Luftwaffe, he said, was the American success in producing a long-range escort fighter that allowed the bombers to penetrate deep into German territory with constant and strong fighter cover. Without that escort, he said, the American air offensive would never have succeeded. A shorter version circulated afterward in American aviation circles. The day he saw Mustangs over Berlin, Göring had said, was the day he knew the war was lost. The line was repeated at squadron reunions and air shows and bar conversations for decades. And it changed in the telling the way any line does that survives only by being passed from one mouth to the next. But the shape of it is consistent across every source that heard it. He did not point at an army. He did not point at the Russian winter, or the collapse of the German economy, or the bombing of his cities. He pointed at one airplane. Consider who was saying it. Göring had commanded fighter pilots. He understood range. He understood exactly what it meant to look up at the sky over his own capital city and see an escort fighter that was not supposed to be there. He was not being gracious in defeat. He was being precise. And the precision of it, the narrowing of an entire war down to a single design decision made by an immigrant engineer at a drafting table in California, is what makes the statement outlast him. Göring was taken from Augsburg to Nuremberg. He was tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and found guilty on all counts. On the night of October 15th, 1946, a few hours before his scheduled execution, he took a cyanide capsule in his cell. He was 53 years old. Bruce Hopper's transcript of the Augsburg interrogation went into the spots papers at the Library of Congress and sat there essentially unread for more than 60 years. The line about the Mustangs over Berlin, however, had already escaped. It was part of the oral history of the 8th Air Force before the ink was dry. The Mustang is often told as a story of American industrial genius. Part of it is that. But only part. The airplane that flew over Berlin on March 6, 1944, was not built by one country. It was built by a man born in a German town who carried Austrian papers, and who became an American because America was the place that would let him build what he was capable of building. By a British engine firm whose engineers had been refining the same design, year by year, for a decade. By a Polish refugee with a slide rule who had escaped through a closing border in 1939 and brought his calculations with him. By a Detroit automobile company that had never built an aircraft engine before the war and built 100,000 of them before it ended. By workers in a Texas plant who had never seen the English airfields where their work would eventually land. The Mustang's advantage was not in any one component. It was in the fact that two governments trusted each other enough to share their most classified designs across a submarine-patrolled ocean in wartime convoys, because both sides believed that what came back would be worth the risk. Germany had built the opposite. A closed country where every decision of consequence ran through one man's headquarters, where every engineer who disagreed learned very quickly to keep quiet. When Göring pointed at the Mustang, he was pointing, without quite knowing it, at that difference. Ronald Harker lived until 1999. For the rest of his life, at air shows, at aviation conferences, at the dinners where men who had flown together would gather and argue about airplanes, he was introduced the same way. The man who put the Merlin in the Mustang. He disliked the title. He thought it gave him credit that belonged to the engineers, to the managers, to the two governments that had said yes when they could easily have said no. All he had done, he would tell anyone who asked, was fly an airplane for 30 minutes and write down what he noticed. He would say it with a kind of mild exasperation, the look of a man who had explained something so many times he could not understand why it still needed explaining. And then someone would ask him to tell the story again, and he always did. If your father flew with the 8th Air Force, if your grandfather was one of the men in a B-17 over Germany who came home because a fighter escort finally showed up all the way to the target, I want to hear about it. Not the history book version. The version he told at the dinner table. The name of the airfield. The name of the man who sat next to him. The thing he said, or the thing he never could bring himself to say, about the missions he flew. Those stories are the actual record of what happened. They belong to the families who carry them, and they deserve to be written down before they disappear. Put them in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary people who, at one moment in their lives, did something that mattered. because it was their moment. They had names. They came from somewhere. They deserved to be remembered.